Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Studying Law Around the World. Today, I have the opportunity to be interviewing Professor Abdi Aidid, and we'll be talking about a lot of exciting things. Really wanted to thank you so much for your time and for the opportunity to be talking with you today, Professor.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. You were so curious about everything, and hopefully I can sustain your interest because I don't know if my story is anything less than boring.
Surely it's not. It's just very interesting to kind of like take a look at your bio and learn a little bit about all the work you've done so far, practicing in New York, in Toronto, leading research at Blue Jay, and also teaching at U of T, and now as a visiting professor, if I understand it right, at Yale Law School.
Hmm.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Sure, yeah. So I grew up in Toronto, where you now live, I guess. And I attended the University of Toronto for undergraduate. And, you know, going to university in the city you grew up in, sometimes you want a change of perspective, a change of pace. And so I actually went to law school in the United States beginning in 2013, and I graduated from Yale Law School in 2016. From there, I practiced law for a couple of years at a firm called Covington and Burling. It's really a DC, Washington, DC based law firm, but I was working primarily in New York. For them, they have offices all over the world. And I was working on litigation, arbitration, all manner of dispute resolution, mostly corporate commercial types of disputes. I left then actually for personal reasons. My mother became ill, and so I moved back to Toronto. And I worked very briefly. I describe it as having a very brief cup of coffee at a firm called Davies in Toronto, fairly well-known firm that is predominantly corporate and transactional, but I worked in their very small and actually highly impressive litigation department. I mean, they were among some of the best lawyers that I encountered in my career. From there, I left and tried something very new, something entirely from left field, which was joining this legal technology company. Actually, I knew the founder and CEO, Ben Allery, earlier from many years before that when I was an applicant to U of T Law School. And we met and he told me a little bit about this opportunity. And so I joined Blue Jay. And at the time, what Blue Jay was doing was using machine learning to try to actually predict case outcomes and was doing so successfully in a manner that was lending itself to use by lawyers, accountants, etc. So I joined to lead the legal research team at the time, which was a team of about four people, a lawyer and a couple of research analysts. And by the time I left some years later, it was a large team. It was the biggest team in the company. We had about 30 staff, including many lawyers, many research analysts. And that was a wonderful experience. Now, throughout that entire time, I was teaching part-time at U of T. I was teaching legal research and writing, and then later a large lecture in civil procedure and a small course in arbitration. Around 2022, I joined the U of T faculty full-time as a tenure track professor, and that's where you and I met. I teach torts among other subjects, civil procedure, arbitration, and I'm also teaching a course on privacy and data governance in the graduate school. So it's been a very lucky and charmed career so far, and I take no credit for it. I will say to the extent that I was involved at all, it was that I was open and curious for new opportunities, and that I think probably accounts for most of the.
Oh, that's amazing. And thinking about all of this roles that you've had, especially related to technology and including the authoring of a book on the legal singularity as well, right? I'd love to hear a little bit about, thinking back on your time as a JD student and then having all of these incredible experiences. What are some of the things that you felt that really shaped your perspective about what the future of the legal profession looks like? And
That's a great question. So I will say this. I couldn't have imagined the possibility of working as the vice president of a legal technology company or teaching courses in law and AI, for example, while I was a JD student, right? In part because what you might call the proliferation of AI in law really didn't begin at that stage. Even though I was in law school relatively recently, it didn't begin at that stage. And so the idea of imagining a career in that space was a bridge too far for me. So I don't want to give myself too much credit. I didn't have that kind of foresight. Instead, I was someone who I think had very deep criticisms of the way that we do law in Canada and the United States in particular. What do I mean by that? Well, think about let's call it the market misallocation, right? You have a high number of people that have unmet legal needs, right? So you have people who cannot afford a lawyer, And this is not just a problem that the poor suffer from, right? The poor have no hope of affording a lawyer. And maybe there's occasional government services that can assist them and voucher programs, depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, to help them get legal aid or whatever it may be. But if you're a poor person, not only do you not have any hope of obtaining a paid lawyer, so to speak, but you probably have limited choices. But lawyers are increasingly critical for navigating our institutions in our society. It used to be the case that you maybe only needed a lawyer when you have a major dispute in your life, right? Or when you're charged criminally. Well, nowadays, you might need lawyers to communicate with tax officials. You need lawyers to deal with landlord tenant issues. You increasingly need lawyers to do things like estate planning. If you're, God forbid, you're in a situation where the custody of your children is at stake, then that's not the kind of situation where you want to go at it alone. And those are still the big high stakes one, but there's so many garden variety social activities now that increasingly require a lawyer. For instance, people are using lawyers right now to reclassify their children into special education streams in schools because when they want their children to get extra assistance at school and get individualized education planning, they have to navigate a complicated procedural process, right? And so lawyers are critical. Now, the poor, if the poor don't stand a chance, right, then that can't be a just or equitable or ethical system, right? Now, I started by saying it's not just a problem of the poor. If you're middle class, even if you're at the sort of a bottom end of what we might call the upper middle class, the cost and the expense associated with a lawyer can get so egregious that it could bankrupt you. Certainly, you're going to make choices that you wouldn't otherwise make if it wasn't for that expense. And for me, there's just something that I can't wrap my head around, which is if law is critical as a guarantor of social rights, if it's important for us in terms of effectuating our interests in society, then why is it that it demands these, very expensive intermediaries? And why are those intermediaries still expensive? So I was very curious for a long time about exactly what justifies the high expense associated with lawyers. And if you actually do some digging, right, you see that, well, part of what accounts for why lawyers cost so much is that lawyers offer specialized skills, right? They offer specialized skills that the market prices at X. Well, is it possible that given that these skills are helping people to navigate public institutions, to obtain benefits, to resolve issues in their life, is it possible that we can replicate some of those skills in a cost-effective manner? And so I became very curious about the role technology could play. And just to put a very fine point on this, in my years as a lawyer, from when I started until today, I'm still a lawyer, right? I was never able to afford myself. I currently could not afford to pay myself the hourly rate that I would command on the private marketplace. Something about that is concerning, right? So one question is, can we use technology to bring down some of those costs? So there's a couple ways you can do that. One way to do that is we can use technology to bring down the cost by making lawyers more efficient. If lawyers are more efficient, maybe they'll be able to pass on some of the cost savings to their clients, or they'll be able to change the model from what you might call a margin model, where a lawyer makes money on a given case or matter they work on, to a more volume model where what matters is that they're able to service a lot of clients and maybe they can bring down the cost that way. That's one way. Or the other way is what you might call retail applications, allowing people to access technology directly to engage in some self-help. So I became very curious about this actually really early. So I didn't quite know that AI was going to be the midwife for these kinds of things, but I was thinking about it fairly early when I was seeing things like LegalZoom. On occasion, I would need to deal with my own situations and then figure out ways to self-remedy, so to speak. And so that was the beginning and end of my curiosity with technology. And this is an important thing that I want to say. I'm not one of those people who's interested in technology because I like gadgets. There are some people who are interested in AI because they are interested in all technology. They're interested in the blockchain too, and they're interested in the latest release from Apple or Samsung, right? That's actually not me, right? I'm just a lawyer who's convinced that these things can be useful in limited context, especially for this access to justice problem that I'm talking about. And so I had let's call it a diagnosis when I was in law school about some of this. It doesn't seem to be working right, but I didn't have the prescription until some years later when we started to see AI was showing us that we had some capability of reducing those costs.
Oh, that's so incredible. It really sounds like you've had lots of like moments where like the reality of what's going on in the day-to-day practice, and then noticing what's actually needed. There was a lot of like, we need to do law differently. Really this gap that you've noticed, I guess, in so many areas, right?
Yeah, well, let me say this too. In law, we haven't done anything that any other profession or industry would recognize as innovation. So think about it this way. Let's just do a little thought experiment. Imagine a courtroom 100 years ago. It would be exactly the same as it looks today, except maybe today there'd be some screens for evidence presentation and some laptops on the counsel's table, right? A law school classroom 100 years ago would look the exact same as it does now. The class that you and I met in, for example, would have been structured the exact same way, and I, as a professor, would have been standing up there largely saying the same things, right? And so there's an open question about that, which is it continuing to stay the way that it is because we have a bedrock belief that it's good enough? Or is it staying the way that it is because we're not critically thinking about ways to make it better and new things that we can do? And so that's part of the constant struggle of thinking about the improvement in the law is why are we doing it the way that we're doing? And, I have a hypothesis, which is that we've created a situation right now where it's actually hard to imagine other possibilities because law has what you might call a totalizing power, right? This is just to make it nerdy. If you ever read Claudio, you ever read Jürgen Habermas or something like that. He talks about the law colonizing the life world, right? The idea being that once law is introduced, everything becomes law-like. Right? Think about like a code of conduct at work. Once upon a time, people would articulate a standard of behavior for you in the workplace and say, Claudia, you better work hard and show up and do your best and do right by customers and be good to your colleagues, right? And there's ways that we can reinforce that behavior socially, communally, almost even like a family, right? Now it's the hyper proceduralized code of conduct, which reads like a statute. And there's an enforcement mechanism that attaches to the code of conduct. And there might be a grievance process, and there might be appeal after that. And somewhere in the background, there's an Employment Standards Act that governs all of it, right? And so much of our life, law is suffusing more and more of our modern institutions. And so now it's critically necessary to evaluate whether or not it's we're doing things the right way, I think. And technology gives us that quote unquote crisis moment, right?
That's amazing. That's such a dive in a little bit of the history of it as well. But there's something that I think it's very interesting. So I actually got to read The Legal Singularity.
Oh, wonderful.
When it came out, I was here in Toronto. I got to see the AI Taxman
Oh,
documentary.
right,
Kind of
right,
like I
right.
followed a little bit of the events preceding it. And what I find interesting is that you mentioned a few things that did not change largely, but then there is the book itself brings a lot of things that did change, and it's especially how we classify information, how the law gets put together, how libraries looked like back in the day, how much information you can have in a small spot now. But I guess the main thing itself, it's the same, which is the content. It just changed a lot of like how we deal with it, where we store it, and how we
Well,
go about it, right?
yeah, so in the book we talk about these three eras of legal information, right?
Mhm.
The analog era is exactly what you know it to be. It's, books, physical media, and all of law is contained in those things, right? And at the University of Toronto, as recently as, I don't know, 20 years ago, we were training students to conduct their research principally by navigating the stacks of the libraries, right? And what's interesting about that is that it has significant equity implications, right? Because if what we know to be the law exists in physical media, then who has access to physical media makes a difference for the quality of the legal advice they can give. There's a biographer of Abraham Lincoln who said that Abraham Lincoln's legal practice was limited by how many books he could carry on his horse. Right? Which is true. It's interesting. I mean, it's kind of a cartoonish way of making a profound point, which is that so long as it exists in physical media, then it's not so portable. Then actually the quality, the entire universe of legal information is limited to that which you can touch and see. And of course, you know, same thing as today. The well-paid corporate law firm is going to have better access to the information than the county lawyer or the local lawyer or the public interest lawyer or even the government lawyer, right? So, but beginning around the 1970s, you have this transition out of analog into digital, the rise of the computer terminal, but also companies like, West, now Thomson Reuters, or Mead, who created LexisNexis, right? You get cool projects that come out of universities initially, like the Queen's University Information Computing Project, I think it's called, QUIC, now known as Quick Law, for instance, right? You start to see law become available and retrievable through these digital databases. Part of what we argue and you use them today, Canly, Lexis, Westlaw, Bloomberg, whatever they may be, right? Part of what we explain in the book is that that shift from analog to digital, even though it's a shift from one era to another, it's not that profound a shift. It's not the quantum leap people say, because all that really happened is the information that exists in the analog area became platformed digitally, but it was the same stuff. I mean, we made the books and whatever cases, statutes available digitally, right? Today, we're in what you might call the computational era, where we say, let's take all the information that was generated in the analog era, platformed in the digital era, and let's treat it as data. And now let's perform functions on top of it, right? Let's train algorithms to retrieve, to identify patterns in the information. Let's use now large language models to generate yet new information from what it's learned, for instance, in about the semantics, the syntax, the diction, the structure of that information. Let's do statistical analyses. Let's use advanced data science techniques to create new information, right? And so that's kind of where we are. That's fascinating. I love that you mentioned the book, and we're proud of the book, but we submitted the manuscript, I think like November 2022. And what happened that month? ChatGPT hit the marketplace. Now, we're observers, so we knew about large language models, generative AI, we anticipated that these things were happening. But it just tells you about sort of the rate of innovation here. When we first started seeing AI image generation tools in 2022, 2023, they were putting noses on people's foreheads. Today, they could trick you. You could think an AI generated image is a real person, right? And so we've come that far, and there are certain ways in which we're going to continue to improve, but I think we know enough now to figure out that we need to make some rules and figure out ways to absorb it culturally and socially, and become better educated about it all.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your comments. Really appreciated that. And something that I wanted to ask you a little more about. Got to listen to a few of the different interviews you've given over the years, and something that you mentioned that I thought was just so interesting is that an observation or maybe a personal feeling that you have is really that AI will allow us to have more time to do a more creative lawyering. So I think some of the arguments you put out there was, there's a lot of the work that we do, the manual work, so to say, ends up taking a lot of time, and then we don't go to law school thinking about writing a factum or doing these things.
We might think about writing a factum, but what we don't want to do is spend hours and hours in the Westlaw universe, right? Trying to find the one case that stands for the one proposition that the partner or whoever you're working for told you exists, but you're now suspecting doesn't exist, right? Like, these are the drudgery involved in a legal practice are not things that we want to continue to do. Or if you want to continue to do them, you should feel free to do them, but at least with the understanding that there's more efficient uses of your time. And for me, this is a critical social imperative. It's not just about us having more fulfilling jobs and lives, though I think that could be a byproduct. I just think that we need to do things better, faster, more cheaply, and more effectively, more accurately, because there are people that have unmet legal needs, right? Emphasis on the more cheaply, right? And technology allows us to get closer to that. Now, it brings with it other problems too, right? I think the key thing in our book, The Legal Singularity, which was I shouldn't say optimistic. It was, it definitely advocated for the increased use of AI in legal systems, right? But the subtitle of the book is very important. It says how artificial intelligence can make the law radically better. And the key word is can, because it's not automatic that it will. Why? Because there are still humans involved. We can still do things. We can import our biases. We can discriminate. We can let this technology and AI become a runaway train. We can fail to adequately regulate it. Or, and this goes back to your question, we can use it in ways that don't reduce costs, but allow us to extract higher prices. Right? So for instance, we live in capitalist systems. There are winners and losers. There's also people that guard information to their advantage. If you're a large law firm and you've had a strong market position for a long time, and you know that data is king in a world of AI, well, you're going to create your own internal white labeled AI tool that's going to be trained on your data. And because you have privileged information, you're going to have an advantage, especially in areas for which things like case law are not published, like in arbitrations, for example. If you're a firm that's the leading arbitration firm, why would you put cases back into the public repository if you've been on the other side of most of them? Why not just train your own internal AI and then suddenly you have an information advantage, right? So I'm not naive here in that I think it's automatically egalitarian. We still have to make choice. We have to legislate. We have to care about each other as a critical bottom line, right? And so I think that's the sometimes I talk to people who are critics of the increases of AI because they are concerned about some of the potential for misuse. And I would say that's technology being layered on top existing problems that we have. And there's are ways in which it deepens and indeed amplifies those problems, right? Think about things like discrimination, right? If there's racial discrimination for a given immigration officer, right? But that immigration officer's case history is being used to train an algorithm that's going to then make immigration determinations. That's a problem. But it's not just that it's a problem, it's that suddenly the technology is more capable of discriminating at a higher clip and with considerably more volume than that immigration officer themselves were. So there's amplification risk. So I'm not naive about this. But I will say, and this is the critical point here, we can't let technology take us off the hook either. I gave the example, maybe in class sometime, about imagine we had an AI tool that was setting our wages for the rest of our lives, right? So forget no more negotiating with your boss. You upload your resume to some tool and it sets your wages for the rest of your life, right? That would, without any other interventions, it would project the gender wage gap into the future. Why? Because if it's based on all the historical data about wages, then it would find that women make 79 cents for every man's dollar, let's say. Right? I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say that. Now, if that happened, we'd be in the streets marching. We'd be like, "You could not you have to unplug this tech," right? Because if it immediately spit out that this woman gets 79 cents and a man gets a dollar for the same qualifications, we would wanna take a baseball bat to the computer. However, the gender wage gap persists socially. It's embedded in institutions. It exists in a diffuse way. It's embedded in relationships, and there appears not to be the political will to completely dismantle it. Right? And so we can look at the AI and be like, "Oh my god, we should never use it in that context." At the same time, we can't take ourselves off the hook from not paying women more. And so there's a way in which technology is both a masking agent of some structural inequality, but it's also in some ways um, a good. It allows us to bring the issues into stark relief, just almost like an empirical tool. It shines some light on some of the contradictions that we have in our society.
That's amazing. I really appreciate just you taking the time to have this conversation because it's been so many different interesting topics that you've brought up. And if I were to ask you, then we talked about, I guess, the practice of law, the information gathering, the social interactions that it goes along with. And I know that some of the courses you teach are very much related to law and international and artificial intelligence. So, when your students will come up and say things like, I want to work with a law and AI, what do you tell them? And in that prospect, if I may add to that question, I spoke with quite a few people that work with privacy law, and it's been more and more popular since the European Union's regulation of privacy and all of that. But before that, we didn't really have privacy lawyers, or at least they weren't called privacy lawyers. They were just
No.
lawyers that also did a little bit of privacy and this and that. And it just kind of like boomed, right? As far as careers go, in a way that, people were able to, from my experience in these chats that I had, people who were new calls were able to take positions that beforehand in a previous market you'd have to be a lawyer who is working 10 years out in the market.
Yes.
But because there just wasn't a 10-year privacy lawyer, then younger attorneys are able to get those positions.
I
So
like this question.
is there some kind of opportunity like that with AI that
Okay, so here's the thing. I actually think that it's a really good time to become a lawyer, right? In part because of what we talked about earlier, which is more and more of the grunt work is being automated, and so there's frees up some time to do interesting, creative things. And let's be serious. We came to law school because we wanted to go into problem solve, be creative. We wanted to have a rhetorical flourish in the courtroom, or we wanted to deliver justice. We wanted to help people, right? Change the world, so to speak, right? So, I think more of your dynamism will be on demand in your profession, which is like really nice. But the other piece of it is there's all these new things now. There's all these things that we couldn't exactly imagine. Same way I told you when I was in law school, I couldn't imagine being the VP of a legal technology company. Claudio, the job that you have in 6, 7 years might not be one that's invented yet. You might be a leading technology lawyer, but the technology that you're dealing with might be some newfangled thing that we can't currently contemplate. And so it's exciting just to wait and see in that way. But separate from that, just the technology that exists today is putting major strains on our legal system, right? What is intellectual property right now? What is privacy at the moment? What is torts if every autonomous, every Tesla you see on the road that has full self-driving is a challenge to our traditional negligence regimes, right? And so there's just going to be, sad to say, a lot of legal issues generated in the short term because of these technology that actually create, to the extent they have a positive byproduct, to create cool opportunities for you and me to think about ways that we can use our skills. That combined with the fact that you can use the technology actually in your practice to be more effective and more efficient means that you can get good faster. And because, you're entering a profession where people have, we started this by saying nothing has ever changed. You're entering a profession that's pretty conservative and in some ways baked into its mold and is unchanging unless it's forced to change. You can hit the ground running and have a bit of an advantage by having some technological fluency, being able to leverage the technology in ways that are responsible, but also being abreast of the issues that it generates, right? So I think there's great opportunity there. There's going to be massive legal changes in Canada. Bill C-27, which was going to revamp our privacy law and also introduce the AI and Data Act, it actually died in committee because of the election, because the government fell. But it'll be back, and that'll be a wholesale change in the privacy law. And we used to have, PIPEDA, we still do, but it's on its way out. PIPEDA and the Privacy Act, and there are lawyers who made their career from having been on the ground floor for that change a generation ago. And so if you're someone who's interested in being useful to your clients on the modern contours of privacy law, then you should observe what's happening right now in the parliament with Bill C-27 and learn about it even before it makes it to getting royal assent, because you will be ahead of the game. You'll be able to provide important advice. And by the way, any company that's worth their salt that is serious about privacy law, they're adapting their practices to the new laws even before they pass, right? And so you have an opportunity to say, you know what? I have this advantage right now. I'm someone who's inclined technologically. There's substantive legal changes that are occurring, and I'm on the ground floor for it. And so you can actually, make a life, well, from just having been early in that way. And so I would encourage students who are listening, monitor developments. Be a relentless court watcher also, right? Because the rest of us in the profession, it takes us a minute to catch up. It takes us a minute to catch up. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. I really wanted to thank you so much for your time,
Oh my
for
God.
bringing up this advice
Audio,
and
I would talk to you.
information.
I would sit here and talk to you anytime, even if we weren't recording.
I really appreciate you, Professor. And I thank you all for tuning into this episode, and we'll see you on the next one.